Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Um, the webinar will start in a few minutes here. We're just going to wait a few minutes to make sure everyone joined. Thank you. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome to the Fall 2021 Roadway Watercourse Crossing webinar series, presented by the Alberta Watercourse Crossing Collaborative and sponsored by the Alberta Conservation Association. My name is Matthew Huberto, and I'll be your host throughout the webinar series. The Alberta Watercourse Crossing Collaborative is a non-for-profit organization whose primary objective is to restore lost and damaged fish habitat from poorly installed and maintained watercourse crossings. We achieve this objective through education and information transfer from subject matter experts to practitioners. This webinar series was created to help achieve those objectives by discussing important topics in an easily accessible format. All of these webinars are recorded and will be available on AWC3's website. After today's presentation, there will be a question and answer period. Questions can be answered by using the webinar toolbar located on the right side of your screen, which will allow you to type in questions. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. Before we start today's webinar, we have a short poll. What is your affiliation? The poll can be answered using the webinar toolbar on the right side of your screen. All right, looks like everyone answered. Thank you. All right, so today's webinar is about Alberta Watercourse Crossing Regulations and Permitting, presented by Mike Hunka. Mike has been a regulator since 2007, working as a fisheries biologist and senior environmental assessment analysis with Fisheries and Oceans Canada from 2007 to 2015, and as a fisheries biologist with the AER since 2015. Mike has experience regulating all aspects of oil, gas, and mining as it pertains to interactions with the aquatic ecosystem and has been involved with the remediation of barriers to fish migration since 2008. Without further ado, here's Mike.
Thank you, Matthew. Just looking for the share here. Did you send that invite? Oh, here we go.
There you go. Sorry about that.
That's good. Thank you. And you can see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much for the introduction. Welcome everybody. And for some of you, this may be a bit of a review, but hoping that there's some additional information that I can share today that helps bring some clarity around the regulatory requirements for permitting for watercourse crossings. And as Matthew said, my name is Mike Hunka. I'm a fisheries biologist by trade. I've been a regulator since 2007 in various roles with Fisheries and Oceans Canada, as well as most recently with the Alberta Energy Regulator. Bit of an outline on what we're going to cover today. We'll get into some of the governing legislation, the agencies that are involved, and then we'll talk about some potential options of addressing remediation on the back end of this program, and how we're looking at options for more area-based closure approaches instead of just single remediation projects, and discuss a little bit about standardized applications. So regulatory overview. So in Alberta, there are two acts that govern watercourse crossings. Those acts are the Water Act and the Public Lands Act. The Alberta Water Act governs how the province of Alberta manages water. The purpose of the act is to promote the conservation and management of water while recognizing the need for economic growth and prosperity, and a flexible management that works cooperatively with governments of other jurisdictions. The Water Act governs the diversion, allocation, and use of water, and regulates and enforces actions that affect water and water use management, the aquatic environment, fish habitat protection practices, and stormwater management. The Public Lands Act establishes the role of the Alberta government in managing public land. It sets out mechanisms by which rights in public land may be transferred by lease or sale. It provides for and defines the powers of the Minister and the Lieutenant Governor and Council with respect to establishing regulations to govern use and allocation of public land. The Act and its regulations also control public land use through the establishment of public land use zones, recreation areas, and trails. The Act provides for appropriate use and management of public land and for the classification of public land based in Alberta. The Act establishes the authority of the Alberta government over the management of the bed and shore of all water bodies in Alberta. There's also the Federal Fisheries Act, which provides a framework for the proper management and control of fisheries and the conservation and protection of fish and fish habitat, including preventing pollution. The focus of my presentation will be on the provincial legislation. However, the provisions of the Federal Fisheries Act need to be taken into consideration when installing and remediating watercourse crossings in Alberta. If there's any questions regarding the Federal Fisheries Act, I can address them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So under the Water Act, all standard applications for watercourse crossings are managed using the codes of practice for watercourse crossings. The codes of practices set out the conditions for the installation, maintenance, and remediation of watercourse crossings. The conditions laid out in the code must be met for your project to be governed under the code. For projects that cannot meet the conditions of the code, an application for authorization under the Water Act must be applied for. Applications for codes of practice are submitted through the one-stop system, where they are tracked and audited. If all the conditions in the code can be met, your project has been deemed to be low risk to impacting the quantity and productive capacity of the aquatic ecosystem. When applying for a when applying for a watercourse crossing under the code, there are several considerations that should be taken into account. These considerations are the location of the crossing, the timing of your works, and the installation type of crossing that you're going to be installing. So the location. When planning a watercourse crossing, the location of the project should be referenced against the existing watercourse classification maps. Alberta has published a set of management maps to support the planning and execution of in-stream projects to prevent significant impacts to sensitive life stages. This map here is an example of the Edson Area Management Map with examples of the following designations of Class A, B, and C habitats. Class A water bodies are considered highly sensitive to impacts resulting from in-stream works. Class A water bodies are designated as critical to the health of fish populations utilizing this designated habitat and rely on the habitats within the designated reach to fulfill a critical life stage. Most Class A habitats in Alberta are known critical spawning areas, which, if disturbed, could have population level effects. In Alberta, Class A habitats comprise less than 1% of all of our water bodies. And in this map here, you can see Class A habitat examples are those that are outlined in red. Class B habitats are also highly sensitive to impacts resulting from in-stream works, but are not considered critical to the health of fish populations utilizing this designated habitat. Class B habitats provide high-quality fish habitat that require additional scrutiny when planning and executing projects. And some examples of some Class B habitats here are those in orange with the circles. Class C habitats are considered moderately sensitive to in-stream works and provide habitat opportunities for multiple species. Most watercourses in Alberta that provide habitat for sport fish are classified as either Class A, B, or C. We also have Class D habitats, which are considered resilient to in-stream perturbation. However, improper works within Class D habitats do have the potential to impact downstream habitats that are more sensitive. Alberta has established restricted activity periods for all watercourses which are designed to protect sensitive life stages such as spawning and rearing. Restricted activity periods should be adhered to where possible. When working in stream during restricted activity periods, more stringent mitigations and the directions of an on-site quace need to be incorporated into project planning and execution to prevent impacts to in-stream habitat and sensitive life stages. Release of sediment to the watercourse can have significant impacts to the spawning success of fish during the restricted activity periods, as some life stages such as eggs and fry are unable to avoid in-stream changes to water quality. And here we have some examples of timing windows within those restricted activity periods. And those timing windows are dependent on the actual species that inhabit those watercourses. In Alberta, there are 5 classes of watercourse crossings, which are designated as either a type 1, 2, 3, or 4, or 5, depending on the installation method and the crossing location within the channel. So here we have some examples of these crossings. So a type 1 crossing, as you see on the top left, means a watercourse crossing that is constructed using a single span bridge, single span pipeline bridge, or other similar structure that does not have abutments that are placed on or within the bed or within the active channel of a water body. A type 2 crossing is example in the top right, is a watercourse crossing that is constructed using an open bottom culvert or a single or multi-span bridge with abutments or piers or other structures that are placed on or within the bed or within the active channel of a water body. Type 3 crossings, which are most common in Alberta, are an example on the bottom left, is a watercourse crossing that is constructed using a round, arch, or box culvert or other similar structure on or within the bed of a water body. And then type 4 crossing, is evidenced here on the bottom right, is a crossing that is a ford or a low-level crossing or other similar crossing where the crossing is constructed at or below the level of the bed of the water body. And type 5 crossings, which I don't have an example of here, means a temporary crossing that is constructed using a log fill, including a log fill combined with snow. Key here is that those are temporary and should be removed prior to the spring freshet. In regards to the installation of crossings in Class A, B, and C watercourses, the code establishes a preference and a set of criteria that must be met to comply with the code. Crossing Class A water bodies is restricted to a Type 1 crossing only and can only be constructed for pedestrian or equestrian use. And in general, planning any crossings in Class A habitats should be avoided. In Class B water bodies, a Type 1 crossing is preferred unless a Type 1 crossing cannot be used. Then a Type 2 crossing if constructed within isolation, and the crossing can meet the requirements of Clause A in Part 1 of Schedule 2, which I will cover in a second. And in Class C water bodies, a Type 1 crossing is still preferred, or a Type 2 crossing if a Type 1 crossing cannot be used, and then a Type 3 crossing if a Type 2 crossing cannot be used. And it must be constructed in isolation, and the crossing must meet the requirements of Clause A in Part 1 of Schedule 2. Some other considerations. The code also sets out the conditions that apply to emergency works and the exclusions that apply during emergency works under Section 6, the requirements to submit plans to the director under Section 7, the conditions that apply to temporary crossings described in Section 10. This includes the exclusion of the code pertaining to temporary forestry crossings, the requirements for reporting under the code in Section 13, including reporting violations, and the requirements for monitoring under Section 15. Specific to the monitoring requirements, the owner must monitor a watercourse crossing in accordance with the plan prepared under Section 7 to ensure that the requirements of this code of practice are met over the operational lifespan of the crossing. So Clause A in Part 1 of Schedule 2. Under the code, all works must meet Clause A in Part 1 of Schedule 2, which states, upon completion of the works, the quantity and the productive capacity of the aquatic environment, including fish habitat, at the watercourse crossing site, where technically feasible and adjacent to the watercourse crossing site, must be equivalent to or exceed that which existed prior to commencing the works. The intent of Clause A in Part 1 of Schedule 2 is to ensure that the works carried out under the code do not result in any harm to the aquatic ecosystem. When carrying out works under the code, proponents need to ensure that the proper planning, mitigation, and execution of the works are undertaken to ensure there is no impact to the quantity and productive capacity of the aquatic environment. This requirement is also in line with the Federal Fisheries Act, which assesses projects related to impacts to determine whether the works are likely to result in a harmful alteration, disruption, or destruction of fish habitat. Where the quantity and productive capacity of the aquatic environment are maintained, the works are unlikely to result in the harmful alteration, disruption, or destruction of fish habitat. And this determination still must be made independently by DFO, so proponents are encouraged to submit their projects to DFO for review where required. When watercourse crossings are installed using proper planning and design, incorporate effective and proven mitigations and best management practices, and are monitored on a regular basis to ensure there are no malfunctions at the crossing, the quantity and the productive capacity of the aquatic environment is maintained. So moving on to the Public Lands Act. Under the Alberta Public Lands Act, the right, title, and interest of the Crown as owner of public land is confirmed. Specific to water bodies, the Act establishes the title of the Crown over the bed and shore of all permanent and naturally occurring water bodies and all naturally occurring rivers, streams, watercourses, and lakes. The established title of the Crown over the bed and shore of all permanent and naturally occurring bodies of water and all naturally occurring rivers, streams, watercourses, and lakes grants the Crown the right to manage and approve any projects that may impact the bed and shore. By establishing the title of the Crown over the bed and shore of all permanent and naturally occurring bodies of water and all naturally occurring rivers, streams, watercourses, and lakes, the Crown of Alberta shares jurisdiction with the Federal Fisheries Act over the management of physical fish habitat in all waters in Alberta outside of federal lands. Under the prohibitions stated in Section 54(1)(d) and E of the Public Lands Act, no person shall cause, commit or suffer the doing of any act on public land that may injuriously affect watershed capacity, and the disturbance of any public land in any manner that results or is likely to result in injury to the bed or shore of any river, stream, watercourse, lake, or other body of water or land in the vicinity of that public land. Like the codes of practice under the Water Act, the Public Lands Act utilizes the Master Schedule of Standards and Conditions to establish how routine works must be carried out on public lands to ensure alignment with the Section 54 prohibitions. Proponents conducting works on public lands must apply the conditions within the Master Schedule of Standards and Conditions in order to meet the requirements when applying for routine works. The application is considered standard when applying for approval under the Public Lands Act, and no deviation from the Master Schedule of Standards and Conditions is requested. Standard applications are considered low risk and undergo an expedited review. When an application is made under the Public Lands Act that requests a deviation from the Master Schedule of Standards and Conditions, a non-standard application process is undertaken, which is reviewed by a public land use officer, as well as other required subject matter experts, such as fisheries biologists, to determine the impacts to public land from the request and what conditions and mitigations are required to adhere to the Section 54 prohibitions. Specific to works in the bed and shore under the Public Lands Act, the Master Schedule of Standards and Conditions sets out a list of desired outcomes and best management practices, along with the conditions which should be incorporated into the planning and design of the project. The list of desired outcomes within the water body and the watercourse and water body section state: number 1, maintain natural drainage; number 2, maintain riparian habitat structure that contribute to the water quality and maintain aquatic life and function; number 3, prevent soil and deleterious substances and/or materials from entering watercourses; number 4, maintain the integrity of the bed and shore; number 5, maintain aquatic and terrestrial habitat; number 6, maintain fish passage; number 7, maintain landscape connectivity along natural movement corridors. There's also some specific best management practices for watercourse crossings that should be incorporated into project planning, which are included within the sections of the Master Schedule of Standards and Conditions. Under the watercourse and water body section of the Master Schedule of Standards and Conditions, the required conditions that must be incorporated into project planning, design, and execution in order to make a standard application are listed. There are a number of conditions pertaining to watercourse crossings that need to be incorporated into project planning in order to meet the standard conditions when applying under the Public Lands Act. Many of these conditions are periodically updated, as well as a few conditions that have been added to address the sensitivity of listed fish species. And some updates to the code. The master schedule of standards and conditions are reviewed regularly and updated as environmental conditions change or in response to auditing on the effectiveness of the conditions to meet the Section 54 prohibitions. Condition 1408 was added to address the increased risk of watercourse crossings in high-risk watersheds inhabited by listed species. Under this change, 1408 now reads, the disposition holder must install a Type 1 or Type 2 structure as defined in the Code of Practice for Watercourse Crossings that maintains the channel for all Class A, B, and C watercourses. Condition 1408 applies to new crossings being installed in high-risk watersheds, which is defined by a spatial layer developed by Alberta Environment and Parks, identifying which watersheds are deemed high risk and requiring proponents to install a bridge or a bridge-like structure to protect listed species and access to their habitats. In addition to these changes, new conditions have been proposed to enforce additional requirements intended to address new threats to the aquatic ecosystem. These have recently been adopted as well. Some examples of these are condition 1419, which now requires proponents to follow Alberta Environment and Parks decontamination procedures, which were developed to address the risk of introduction of aquatic invasive species. 1419 reads, for use of equipment within the bed of a water body, the disposition holder must, prior to operations, follow the decontamination protocol for work in or near water, as amended from time to time. Condition 1420 requires proponents to keep and provide records of their decontamination procedures when requested, as well as during routine inspections. Another new condition, 1421, will require annual inspections of all watercourse crossings utilizing Alberta Environment and Parks Watercourse Crossing Management Directive. 1421 reads, the disposition holder must monitor all watercourse crossings and report all findings by November 30th of each year as per the Watercourse Crossing Management Directive. Condition 1422 requires that the disposition holder must report all watercourse crossing remediation or maintenance efforts as per the Watercourse Crossing Management Directive. So shifting gears now a little bit more onto the remediation side. The steering committee overseeing the roadway watercourse crossing directive has been developing procedures to streamline the remediation process in support of watershed remediation plans. Under the directive, member companies are required to inspect their watercourse crossings and develop watershed remediation plans to address barriers to fish passage. The steering committee is exploring options to have companies work together within watersheds where they have joint operations to submit integrated watershed remediation plans with the support of regulatory agencies. The intent of these watershed remediation plans is to achieve efficiencies and cost savings for members where possible and to expedite remediation to address the fragmentation of fish habitat. In the phase 1 area, the directive was focused on addressing the fish passage issues within listed species habitat, which has been deemed to be a significant factor in population declines. By addressing remediation at the watershed scale, fisheries managers will be better equipped to reverse the declining trends seen in listed species populations. To support the streamlining of the remediation process, the steering committee is also looking at options to standardize the application process, including developing a list of standard mitigation measures that would be applied to all projects. The steering committee is also looking at options for streamlining applications based on the proposed remediation work, as there are various options available to address barriers to fish passage. While remediation of crossings is covered under the code, some projects will require in-stream works to address impacts to the channel, which may fall outside of the 20-meter workspace covered under the code. Works on the channel will often require an approval under the Water Act and a TFA, or a temporary field authorization under the Public Lands Act. These application processes are being examined to support streamlining efforts, as a formal review is required when the works are not covered under the code. To ensure watershed remediation plans are effective at addressing fish passage issues, Alberta Environment and Parks is developing a watershed model that will allow the regulatory bodies to provide support and direction to industry when requested on which crossing remediation projects within each watershed would result in the greatest benefits to the species present. The model builds off the AER model and will be supported by input from regulatory biologists and focus on remediation of crossings that will restore access to the greatest amount of important fish habitat within each watershed. While the intent of the directive is to remediate all barriers to fish passage, the steering committee recognizes that limited resources are available in each budgeting cycle, and therefore the focus of the regulatory input is on ensuring remediation dollars are providing the greatest benefit to species inhabiting each watershed. So we'll just get into a little bit of the AER's inspection tool that was developed. In 2016, the AER began looking at how to best deploy inspectors on the landscape to support the roadway watercourse crossing directive. This involved engaging our data scientists on how to look at the issue, this issue from a data perspective, and to determine whether the deployment of staff could be achieved by predicting the likelihood of barriers existing on the landscape. The focus of the project was to provide inspectors with a tool that would help them determine where fish passage issues were likely to exist on the landscape, thereby increasing their effectiveness at supporting the objectives of the directive. Development of the tool was achieved by engaging inspectors, subject matter experts, and specialists to determine what information was relevant to predicting barriers to fish passage. The tool works by taking all of the required information and layering it all together in one place. And the finalized tool will incorporate all of the crossing inspections conducted by the regulatory agencies, industries, and municipalities to develop a comprehensive view of each watershed. The tool also builds in risk criteria to predict the likelihood of a barrier to fish passage. And with the recent inclusion of the Alberta Environment and Parks inspection data, an audit of the tool's predictive ability has resulted in achieving roughly 85% accuracy on predicting where fish passage concerns exist. As more data is entered into the tool, the machine learning component is able to increase the accuracy of its predictive powers, focusing on where barriers to fish passage are likely to occur, which can then also be verified through inspections. So just here's what the tool looks like on our internal servers. It's a GIS-based model that allows the user to view the landscape at various scales. This dashboard was used to support the development of Alberta Environment and Parks model, which incorporates various other metrics at assessing fish passage concerns and remediation priorities. And Axel Anderson with Alberta Environment and Parks will be presenting on their tool that they're creating here on the November 18th online conference. So I would highly recommend everybody attend that. Axel's work has been absolutely amazing in progressing the overall directive. So just a little bit more about the AER's tool. So the watersheds are color coded based on their overall priority that was developed early on in the implementation of the directive. These color-coded watersheds here are the 2015 to 2020 priority list of watersheds, and it was developed based on the amount of linear disturbance, the number of listed species present, FSI or Fish Sustainability Index scores, and with input from area biologists. And so zooming right in, we actually can see where there are barriers on the landscape. And so the darker pink circles represent increasing probability of a barrier existing at a location. And the tool calculates this probability by taking into account past inspections, the slope, the stream power, the discharge, and the soil classification. And so once an inspection is conducted, the information is uploaded into the tool when connected to the server, and inspections that identified no issues with fish passage are then displayed in green over top of the pink circles. So an example would be the watercourse crossing on the left of the image there. Unfortunately, the green dot's not quite on top of the pink one, but that's basically what our tool will show, is that was a predicted barrier, but it was inspected and was shown not to be. And then increasing the number of inspections entered into the database ultimately results in increasing the predictive power of the tool. The AR tool allows a calculation to be made of the upstream stream length that will be reconnected depending on the watercourse crossings chosen for remediation. And collaboration between the regulatory agencies and the area fisheries biologists ensures alignment with the local fisheries management objectives, as well as focusing on known productive habitats that are present. The development of the remediation prioritization component of the model was undertaken at requests for input on remediation priorities that were received from industry members. The model takes a watershed approach in identifying which crossings remediation projects will result in the restoration of access to the greatest amount of fish habitat. So here we see some barriers on the landscape in the red dots. And basically the tool is calculating which of those were remediated, how much habitat upstream of that would be restored. The model looks at the upstream distance from each identified barrier to fish passage to allow comparisons to be made between barriers within a given watershed. By comparing the total available habitat upstream of each barrier, the model can support decision-making on which crossings should be prioritized within a watershed to provide the greatest benefit to fish in the shortest amount of time. While the model only calculates the upstream habitat availability, input from biologists is also taken into account, thereby ensuring habitat quality is also factored into remediation planning. The tool also provides the details on the inspections, the issues that were identified, and uploading site photos is also being built into the functionality. We've since abandoned that, given AEP's tool now allows that, so that will be a huge step forward as well. This has allowed regulatory agencies to look at a watershed and prioritize remediation works, which will support planning by industry. Consideration is also taken when looking at restoring connectivity among watersheds, which requires working downstream to upstream to ensure connectivity to the main stems connecting watersheds is restored. And I'll stop there and take any questions if anybody has any.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mike. Just a reminder, if you have any questions, you can type them in the GoToWebinar toolbar, which should be on the right side of your screen. So our first question is, are the Code of Practice maps regularly updated to include critical habitat for species at risk?
Excellent question. So the Code of Practice maps, there has not been any significant updates in the last few years. There was conversations around whether or not Class A habitat should be applied to all identified critical habitat as per species recovery plans governed under the Species at Risk Act. That has currently not been undertaken. So Class A habitat itself has not been changed significantly in the last number of years. And I guess moving forward, we'll see what the province's approach is to that. But currently, no, there has not been any updates to the watercourse classifications in regards to species at risk.
Okay, our next question, are variances allowed in high-risk watersheds for culvert-like structures if the culvert is proven to meet fish passage requirements for the target species?
So that would be considered a non-standard application. It would be reviewed. There is some considerations given for a variance in a high-risk watershed that would allow a culvert to be installed. However, it's very much dependent on the status of the species that are present. It depends on the trawler order of that creek itself. And basically what that means is the size of the creek. In most cases that I have reviewed personally, the only types of variances that we're granting are in, trawler order 1 sort of headwater streams that have very low habitat diversity and potentially may not provide critical habitat from a direct use perspective. So, an Athabasca rainbow trout may not actually be utilizing that habitat, but that does not mean that habitat is not supporting the productivity of rainbow trout habitat downstream. So in some instances, yes, we would consider a variance. There, obviously it would have to be well defended, and the required information would have to be submitted for review for us to make that decision.
Perfect. So the next question. Often when you are doing watercourse crossing replacements, you do not require us to submit an application to public lands because you are working within the right-of-way. Many companies then use this as a way to continue to install Type 3 crossings, despite the master standard schedule for conditions outlining a Type 1 crossing being needed to be installed. How do you prevent this from occurring going forward?
That's an excellent question. We are well aware of that. So basically any new install would still require a public lands approval. So that would be covered under new installs. The gap is absolutely, as this question identifies, is in existing structures. The way that is being looked at currently is, if you do read the directive itself, it clearly states in the directive that a type 1 or 2 crossing should be installed in high-risk watersheds. That's clearly stated in the directive. From a legislative perspective, there isn't the legislative support for that yet. However, there is a review of the Water Act currently that is underway. And again, without speaking too far in advance, there is obviously a consideration and a lot of intent to enshrine the directive within the Water Act itself. And so I'll just leave it at that, but we are most definitely aware of that, and we're looking at how we basically close that regulatory loop.
Perfect. All right. So next question, please confirm how the new clauses within the MSSC apply to dispositions that were issued prior to the first issue of the MSSC in 2010.
Another excellent question. So currently you are only bound by the conditions of your current approval. So any updates to the MSSCs would not come into effect until you renewed your disposition, or if the director chooses, at any time the director can amend the conditions of any existing disposition. So hypothetically, if we wanted to attach the condition of a type 1 or type 2 crossing in all high-risk watersheds, the director has the authority to open all of those dispositions in those areas and attach that condition to them. So that is 2 regulatory mechanisms that can be undertaken to address that.
Okay, and our next question's concerning reporting. Do crossing owners have to report their inspection data if they are not members of the Watercourse Crossing Program?
That's another excellent question. So currently there is, I have to be careful how I answer this here. So there is within the Water Act codes a requirement to report. Now, that being said, it's normally when we get applications, the reporting and or monitoring mechanisms may be fairly vague. That being said, though, there is again that requirement to do inspections and to report non-compliances, which is currently already enshrined in the code. So It is a bit of a gray area if you want to call it that. In my experience, it's been not strictly enforced, but that being said, it's much more of an issue now given the current status of fish and fish populations in Alberta. So that is still being considered as a regulatory tool of basically requiring monitoring to be done. And so I think probably your best answer to this is to await the amendments to the Water Act, because it will be much more clear, in my opinion, from what I've heard and seen, that those requirements will be very well spelled out in the new addition to the Act. And it also, again, in the directive is clear on new requirements. Non-members don't have the same agreement, I would say, in place, because member companies are voluntarily submitting that information to us. But the legislative authority does currently exist to compel and require monitoring and reporting to be submitted where we see it. Well, basically, if we choose to enforce it, right, it would be another director required amendment to your application. Or it says actually in the Water Act that if the director requests it, you have to provide it. So if we request it, you have to provide it. That's probably the simplest answer.
Thank you. Our next question, what are the current and proposed requirements for decontamination equipment working within the high water mark but outside of the wetted perimeter?
Another great question. So the decontamination protocols are clearly spelled out in Alberta Environment and Parks decontamination. I don't have the name of the document currently on hand, but it's clearly spelled out in there what's required. If you're working below the ordinary high water mark, you're within the channel. That's what's considered within the channel. So you must still decontaminate. And the requirements for doing so, it's dependent on who you are. So industry is held to the same standard as the public for clean, drain, dry. So basically you need to completely clean all mud, debris, vegetation, everything off of your machinery prior to getting to site, and then prior to departing site. You have to clean all of that off. You have to wash all your machinery down, and then you have to allow it to dry. And so basically that's the exact same requirements as an angler that is taking his boat in and out of lakes or rivers in the province. As a fisheries biologist or as a government employee, the standard of decontamination is much more stringent. We have to go through multiple different decontamination procedures depending on where we are and where we're working. That involves the use of cleaning chemicals, quat or bleach. There's high temperature wash required. It's much more stringent, and it's based mostly on what type of activity you're actually conducting and your ability to decontaminate certain things. But that's all spelled out in AEP's decontamination guidelines.
All right, next question. How and how frequently will the remediation priorities be communicated to industry for consideration?
So the remediation priorities have been clearly communicated since probably 2018-19. The most recent update to the directive in 2020, that was in draft form for over a year. So the remediation priorities have been clearly set out. They haven't changed. I don't think they've changed at all since early on in 2016, I believe, 17 in there, where we actually developed the priority watershed hierarchy. So every single watershed in the province of Alberta has been ranked from 1 to 400 plus. That is the priorities of what is intended to be remediated first. That doesn't necessarily mean, that we will not entertain other remedial projects. It's just those have to be justified why you're stepping outside of the prioritization. The prioritization itself was done specifically looking at which watersheds had the most listed species, the condition of that population or populations where we have multiple listed species in that watershed, the linear disturbance, the overall status of that fishery, and any other compounding factors. So basically, AP used a cumulative effects model that they have to support the prioritization of the watersheds themselves. And so the priorities of the watersheds are unlikely to change significantly, I would say. You may see a small shift up or down 1 or 2 spots for a watershed that might have some other remedial actions that are being undertaken by either AP or Trout Limited or some other entity that would, benefit from additional remedial works. So there may be a slight shifting, but by no means would I expect to see, watershed 1 drop to watershed 50 in the priority ranking. They might move 1 or 2 places up or down, but what you see is the priority list for watershed prioritization. And apologies if that's not been communicated. That is in the directive. I can make sure if somebody doesn't have access to that, I can provide that.
Perfect. All right, so our next question is regarding watercourse crossing submissions. Are there rules or guidelines around batch processing watercourse crossing submissions? Should they all be in one working area or stream network? Can a batched submission include different crossing types to be submitted together?
That's an excellent question. So for batching should only be undertaken for remedial works. And maybe just while I'm answering, just have the questioner clarify if they're asking about new installs or if this is specific to watercourse remediation. So I'll just speak from the remediation side. Remediation should be batched within a single watershed. It, again, can be batched with other proponents' projects potentially. That depends ultimately on whether there's collaboration around machinery sharing, that sort of stuff. I mean, it's all very specific to the application, but in regards to batching, it should only be done for within a single watershed itself. And then when we're looking at that, it's ideally the same type of crossing. And I only say that from the perspective of issuing approvals with multiple different types of crossings, potentially has different conditions associated and mitigations associated with each individual crossing type. So ideally the batching would be for a single crossing type, but that being said, we can always look at that. I guess the long and short is yes, you can batch different crossing types as long as the most stringent mitigations will be applied to every single crossing installation or remediation that you're doing, because that's where you would have potentially a variation in what mitigations are required, depending on, if you're installing a bridge completely outside of the ordinary high water mark versus installing a culvert or an arch where you have to completely isolate the channel for multiple days and there's, dewatering, fish handling, all that sort of stuff. So there is definitely considerations given the type of installation that you're doing. So that would be my only caveat there is, yes, you can batch, but ideally it's the same crossing types that you're batching. And if not, then you have to be very clear on what mitigations apply to what specific projects within that batch.
All right, the next question is the remediation tool open to industry to get potential ideas for offsetting throughout the Federal Fisheries Act?
Oh, that is a loaded question. So currently, the remediation tool has not been released externally. That I can't speak for at this point. I would suggest that question be asked at our half-day conference on November 18th. AP will be able to answer that question more clearly than I can. In regards to offsetting, that is a very interesting question. There's And so I'm going to just be very clear. I'm speaking from my own experience at DFO prior to the changes in the act. So this is not necessarily current information, and I do not currently represent DFOs. But that being said, in the conversations that I've had and in my experience, proponents looking to remediate fish passage issues of another owner has not usually been accepted, given it's a compliance issue. So offsetting is intended to address reductions in the overall productive capacity. I'll use Alberta's language for this, but ultimately it's intended to ensure there's not a reduction in fish habitat overall, right? And so where you have a compliance issue, because ultimately a barrier to passage is a compliance issue, both under the Federal Fisheries Act and under Alberta's legislation, trying to offset that, trying to address that issue by proposing to do offsetting as part of your project's impacts normally wasn't accepted. That being said, I'm not saying it has not ever been accepted in the past. There is certain considerations that are taken into account. So for an example, again, not speaking for DFO, if there was, say, abandoned infrastructure that had no owner, that potentially could be looked at as an option versus a disposition that has an active company that owns it that's simply not choosing to remediate that is normally where it would not be accepted. But I would, whoever asked that question, thank you. That was an excellent one. I would suggest you follow up with DFO on that to be very clear on where that may be considered. But ideally, the remediation tool that's being developed is not intended to identify offsetting projects. That's not what it's intended to do.
All right, thank you. There's several questions left, but unfortunately it looks like we're gonna run out of time in our question and answer period here, but I'll ask one more. Is the AER model focused just on energy dispositions or all roadway crossings?
That's an excellent question. So originally when we designed the model, the initial intent of that model was specifically to identify where potential barriers would be to allow more effective deployment of AER inspectors. That being said, that model evolved over time to include various other aspects, including calculating upstream distance from barriers, looking at how it could be used for remediation planning. All of that was built onto the model after the fact. And so that model itself was sort of our working model until we shared that with AEP, and then that has now been, AEP has advanced that model significantly from where it first started. So it's AEP's model now, I would say, that we're relying on in regards to prioritizing remediation. And again, I would highly recommend you attend the November 18th webinar series or conference, pardon me, because yeah, Axel will go into that model. It is, frankly, it'll revolutionize, in my opinion, how we do remediation. That it's much more focused on how to deploy remediation dollars on the landscape. That's more of its intent. So the AER model was more front end focused on inspections, and originally the AEP model now is much more focused on identifying where remediation would be most effective.
All right, perfect. Thank you for that, Mike, and thank you to everyone who asked questions. If we didn't get to your question, sorry about that. We're just running out of time here. We can potentially answer it and post it to AWC3's website along with the webinar video. So please join us again Thursday, October 28th for our next webinar on sediment risk and road design presented by Michael Wagner from Alberta Agriculture and Forestry. Thanks again to Mike Hunka for today's presentation and to the ACA for sponsoring this event. Have a great day, everyone, and thank you for joining.
Thanks, guys. Yeah, I'd highly recommend you attend the next one. Michael's is an excellent presentation as well.
Yeah, I'm looking really forward to it.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Take care, everyone.